Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
The Tories won, Labour was wiped out. The far right came second, and two left of Labour parties rose significantly.
Those are the results in the general election in my home country of the Netherlands, but they don't tell the whole story.
The Dutch Tory party, like Mrs Thatcher in the 1980s, partially suppressed the vote of the far right by internalizing much of their rhetoric and some of their politics.
But Geert Wilders increased his presence in Parliament from 12 seats to 19, and that's somehow supposed to be a cause for celebration.
Joining us, as he promised when he was last here, is specialist in European politics, Dr. Russell Foster from King's College London. Dr. Russell, thanks for joining us. Give us the headline. Geert Wilders rose from 12 to 19. He's now the second biggest Parliament party. Should we be celebrating?
I don't think that this is any reason for a cause for celebration whatsoever. The international press have been keeping a very close eye on the Dutch electoral campaign because this is the year of elections and the year that will decide the fate of the Union. Now, the first in the three sequence of elections were the Dutch. Normally, the international press would not be particularly concerned about electoral politics in a country like the Netherlands.
Tell me about it.
But as a consequence of what happened last year, there's been a lot of emphasis on it. Now, during the campaign, there was a lot of fear that Wilders was going to ride in on this populist tidal wave, vaguely similar to Brexit, to Trump, and to the referendum in Italy back in December. This initially doesn't seem to have happened. So we opened the newspapers or checked online this morning to find that Rutte is pronouncing that this is a great victory, that the Dutch people have stopped the populist tide, that they've had enough of the wrong sort of populism. This is a very, very bad way to interpret what's happened. The two major parties, two major establishment parties in the Netherlands, the Conservatives and the Labour movement, have both lost support. The Labour movement has been eviscerated, and it will take a very long time for them to make a comeback. Who has made gains are the anti-establishment, or at least outside of the establishment parties. The Green Left, the Party for Freedom, and a couple of others which have gained seats. Now, these don't share the same political platform, but they are united in that they are not the establishment parties. Now, Rutte's claim that the Dutch people have gone against populism is clearly not true. Now the second biggest party in the government is going to be Wilders PVV. In places like Rotterdam, it is the dominant party that they won most of the seats. So we've seen a fundamental shift in Dutch politics in the last 36 hours from the old establishment movements towards parties which are outside of the old clique. So to interpret the recent Dutch election as support for liberalism, as support for the status quo, is simply not the way that we're seeing developments in the Netherlands.
What about the point we made in the introduction, that one of the reasons why Rutte will continue as Prime Minister is that he began to ape many of the tropes and rhetoric of Wilders himself?
Absolutely. This is something that we're seeing in France, in Germany. We saw it last year in the United Kingdom, and most prominently we've just seen it with Rutte taking the language and the themes of Wilders's movement and appropriating them for himself.
Not only Rutte, all the mainstream.
Exactly, they all have.
For that matter.
You'll recall around a month ago, Rutte took out a full-page advert in most of the Dutch newspapers, which effectively stated, if you don't like it here, then leave. Now, this is something that would have been unimaginable for a mainstream party to do back in, say, the 2011 elections. But now we're seeing perhaps a similar symptom to what we've seen with the mainstream parties in the United States and in other European countries, where a fear of bleeding away supporters to anti-establishment parties means that the ruling establishment groups are appropriating the same language. So to see this as some sort of victory against populism is quite myopic because it is a victory of parties who are offering a watered-down version of the same thing that Wilders is offering.
So you see that as same as populism? Obviously, it's not against populism.
Precisely.
So it's in no way a vote against Wilders?
Absolutely not.
No tactical voting here?
Well, I don't know to the extent that tactical voting has occurred in the Netherlands with their Byzantine structure of so many different parties and candidates running. Maybe tactical voting is a little more difficult. But this does bring up one problem that the international media have in interpreting the Dutch elections, which is that we're so used to dealing with a first-past-the-post system like the British and the Americans, that we assume that, oh, Wilders has come second, therefore he's lost.
Yeah.
It doesn't work like that in European systems, so he's gained tremendous support.
What role did the rather conflicted confrontation with Turkey play? Did this help Rutte appear tough on Islam, tough on Muslims? Did he do it in a premeditated way to try and steal some of Wilders' clothes?
Well, if we look at most of the media today, we'll see the claim that Rutte was able to ride on the back of this Turkish diplomatic incident to make himself look very statesmanlike, very dignified, calm, cool and collected. Maybe it has helped his campaign in that he's been able to show the Dutch people that he is an effective politician. Bearing in mind that Rutte still has a lot of criticism towards his economic policies and his social policies in the Netherlands, he's been able to ride on this diplomatic incident. But he's not the only person who's benefited from it. Let's remember that his party has just lost 8 seats. Wilders' party has just gained 5. So as much as it has helped Mark Rutte, it's also helped Geert Wilders, who has been able to appropriate this to put across his own message.
Now, the biggest loser was the Labour Party. Jeremy Corbyn is not the leader of the Dutch Labour Party, but they've been effectively wiped out, haven't they?
They have. They've gone down from approximately 30
29 to 9?
38.
It's, they've been eviscerated. They still have a few strongholds left, but that level of electoral defeat in a single day, I don't think it marks the end of the Dutch Labour Party, but it does see a similar shift to what we've seen in at least the United Kingdom, where the old left-wing socialist parties are no longer appealing.
Well, isn't the problem that they weren't left-wing socialist parties? PASOK was eviscerated in Greece. The PSOE in Spain has been effectively blighted by the rise of Podemos. The Socialist Party in France is in such bad odour that the president couldn't even run for a second term. And Jeremy Corbyn has around 26% in the polls in Britain, which is 5 points down on Ed Miliband in 2015. Are we seeing the sun setting on social democratic politics, but the rise of other radical forces in their place?
This is an interesting way to interpret it. Now, a lot of the traditional left-wing socialist parties in Europe have been accused for the last few years of promoting austerity light, of enacting the same policies as the old right-wing parties, just with a slightly more sociable conscience to it. What we are seeing is, across Europe, is a rise in people who are dissatisfied with the old status quo parties, not just dissatisfied with the old conservative right and not just with the old socialist left, but with the entire system, which is increasingly interpreted by tens, possibly hundreds of millions of Europeans as benefiting only a small transnational clique while ignoring the majority of the populations of European nations.
Well, that has the benefit of being the truth. The rise of the Green Left, tell us about them. They came from absolutely nowhere.
They've suddenly appeared out of nowhere, it would seem. Now, I wonder whether the Green Left's rise is going to be analogous to what we saw with the Liberal Democrats in Britain in the more recent elections, that dissatisfied with existing parties, but equally fearful of what appears to be a raving ethnic nationalist in another party, people have decided to throw their weight behind a new movement. Now, it seems likely that the Green Left is going to be invited into Rutte's new coalition so that he can draw support from people who have thrown their weight behind this.
That would be the kiss of death for them, in my opinion. But
well, it would in exactly the same way that it was the kiss of death for the Liberal Democrats when they joined with the Conservatives,
Exactly.
because as we've just seen in the last coalition between the Dutch Conservatives and the Dutch Labour, Rutte was able to basically throw his partner under the bus in order to gain votes during the election. Now, are we going to see the same thing with the Green Left?
Are they more green or are they more left?
At the moment, they seem to be more green, and simply using this rhetoric will have a lot of appeal, especially in a country like the Netherlands. This is going to have a much greater appeal among young people, among the urban elites, and especially in the Netherlands. As we know, this is an overwhelmingly urban country. So they do seem to have this appeal to a large section of
It helps that the new leader, is now like the Dutch Trudeau.
It does help, but does it also mean, is it also possible that people's hopes are going to be somewhat dashed by this new leader? We saw this happen with Syriza in Greece. We saw this happen with the Liberal Democrats. Maybe to a lesser extent we saw this with Bernie Sanders. This points to me what is one of the most significant issues in this year of elections. It's the role of emotion. It's not rational economic politics. It's how people feel. Now, if people are throwing their political hopes and emotions behind particular parties, and then due to the reality of coalition politics, those parties maybe have to shift on their principles, is people's disappointment and disillusionment going to grow even further? What happened yesterday in the Dutch elections was not a victory for liberalism, and it may mean that in the next round of Dutch elections in 4 or 5 years' time, we're going to see even more people swinging towards a populist movement because they'll feel disappointed by new parties.
Very briefly, Doctor, what does this tell us about France, which is next up, and Germany, which is up after that?
I think it's going to be the case that Wilders will be able to portray himself as being a symbol against the establishment elite. Wilders is going to, if he's clever, he's going to now take a back seat in Dutch politics and keep a low profile, just keep out of the public eye. He's now in quite a strong position that while Rutte is trying to assemble a complicated coalition, Wilders and his MPs can sit back and snipe at everything that the new government does without having to take any flak themselves because they don't have any power. This is going to give an added incentive for the AfD, for Marine Le Pen, who will be able to point to Wilders saying he represents a large group of the Dutch electorate who are being ignored by the ostensibly arrogant mainstream parties. So even if Le Pen loses in the election, and even if AfD, which they're almost certainly going to lose in the German elections, even when that happens, they can still point to Wilders and say, we are in this position like Wilders of being martyrs. So it will add to their strength.
Well, I must ask you to come back and talk about both France and Germany. We're all going to become very well acquainted with each other. Thank you, Dr. Russell Foster, for coming on the Sputnik.
Coming up next, we will be discussing the little reported Yemen. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Sputnik. The Rocks of Aden were Britain's imperial last stand, at least until the era of Tony Blair. The British colony of Yemen fought itself free of empire, but seems to have been fighting a lot of the time since. Fighting between the south of the country and the north, and civil war between the periphery and the centre have now been succeeded by an all-out assault by Saudi Arabia and its Western allies, including Britain and the US, on the poorest Arab country of them all.
British and US weapons have rained down on schools and hospitals, funerals and wedding parties, killing thousands of civilians and prompting demands for an end to arms sales to the Saudi invaders.
David Hearst is the distinguished writer and editor of much of the best commentary on the Middle East and is now editor-in-chief of Middle East Eye. And he joins us now. David, thanks for coming on board the Sputnik again. What is the news from the front? I need to ask you because, frankly, it's not reported anywhere else.
Well, the government of Yemen, or rather the rump government of Yemen, is now back in the south. The Houthis are in the north and in the centre. They still control the biggest port, and there's now going to be an all-out coalition assault on that port. And what really is concerning me, and is concerning a lot in the international community, is that Yemen is on the verge of a major famine.
Exactly.
You've got 500,000 children who are suffering from acute malnutrition. You've got 7 million Yemenis who are closer than ever to starvation. And the Saudis and the Americans and the Brits are just about to close off the port. Now, the port is really essential because 80 to 90% of food goes through it. So yes, it's obviously a complicated civil war, and there are wrongs on both sides. I mean, one of the figures behind, of course, the Houthi uprising was the old dictator Abdullah Saleh. So, you know, we're talking about a complex situation here. But in terms of the human devastation, Yemen has never been treated as if it is a country. It needs a major aid influx. It does not need another siege.
The bombing has killed thousands, but the famine could kill millions.
Yeah, we've seen glimpses of it by very rare reports, because I understand journalists are just not allowed access there, and it looks really horrific.
Well, the Middle East Eye was allowed access through the Houthis to Sana'a, and then to the north to Sada, which is totally bombed out, and that's on the Saudi border. And the devastation that we saw there was unbelievable. We had doctors come up to us and say, look, babies are dying in my incubators because you know, we can't get the drugs. It's all controlled by militias, and as in all of these conflicts, food distribution is also controlled by militias. So there are sieges within sieges, and both sides are playing a very dirty game. But the really important thing to emphasise here is that Britain is behind one of them.
Yes, I was going to ask you that. You used the word coalition. Who's in this coalition that's bombing and starving Yemen?
Well, principally the Saudis, and then America, and then us, and a whole bunch of countries who are basically arms suppliers to the Saudis. There was a very interesting court case in London recently, which gave you a very rare glimpse of the relationship, the arms relationship between Britain and Saudi Arabia. And like all of these court cases, it suddenly went secret. You had 2 days of open testimony, which was brought by the Campaign Against the Arms Trade. It's a case in which they said they're accusing the British government of completely failing to uphold their obligations under international human rights law. And then suddenly on the 3rd day, it all went secret. It went into camera and the journalists were chucked out. This is exactly what happened, if you remember, when there was a serious fraud office investigation into
the Al
Yamamah.
Yeah,
exactly the same thing. And then suddenly Tony Blair came down and said, whoops, this is a special relationship. It's all secret. Suddenly it all went dead. And you had a lot of angry policemen phoning the Guardian up saying, over our dead bodies. But in fact, it happened. Exactly the same thing is happening now. It's suddenly, you get it to a stage of information, and then suddenly, whoops, you run into a brick wall.
You see, Gayatri said that the reason for the media silence is that journalists can't go in. I don't buy that myself. It seems to me there's a willful decision by the British state, and therefore its echo chamber, the so-called mainstream media, that this special relationship with Saudi Arabia is so embarrassing, so shameful, that it would be damaging to us as a state if people were to know about it.
But this court case did actually provide a rare glimpse into actually how many people we've got, including at the operational centre where the targeting is done. We've got 100 civil servants there.
In the command cell that's directing the war?
No, in Saudi Arabia as a whole. But there is a man of group captain level there who is sitting in the operations room. Now, the evidence that came out in that court case was that the Saudis are not giving us any information about their targeting, even though they are using our weapons, and they're using the worst anti-personnel, fragmentation bombs in it. And they're not giving us the information, but we are certainly giving them the arms. So and there are odd glimpses. I mean, there was one particularly honest soul who said, you know, in his gut, he didn't think that we should continue to carry out this arms trade. The arms trade as such is incredibly important to BAE. It's basically a lifeline to it. There are 9,000 jobs dependent on it, and we sent a reporter up to Lancashire to find out what the local feeling was, including what the trade union feeling was. And they were absolutely, it was like talking to government employees. They were absolutely behind. They said, someone's got to do this. We've got to do it. Otherwise, there are no jobs. That begs another question as to why the structure of the... I'm not blaming workers, factory workers, who need a £40,000 wage. No one in their right mind would blame them. What I'm pointing at is the system whereby our aircraft industry is so totally dependent on weapons of mass destruction.
Well, it's unconscionable for the rest of us who are not employed making weapons for £40,000 a year that can be a reason for continuing to supply weapons to anybody at all for any purpose at all. No civil society would knowingly, willfully make a judgment that that should be so. Thus, it's my case that this has to be all kept as quiet as possible. As you know, as I do myself, there's no shortage of weapons in Yemen. Every Yemeni has many weapons. They are actually quite good fighters. Nobody since Genghis Khan has succeeded in subduing them, including the British, the Argyll and Southern Highlanders and the rocks of Aden. This can't end well for the Saudis, it seems to me.
It can't end well. However, if you actually look at what's going on in Saudi, all the power, virtually all the power, is in the hands of one young man.
Yeah, 30 years old.
30 years old, who has enormous power. Originally, when the king took over, there was a division of power between bin Salman and his uncle, bin Naif. But bin Naif is basically, who is the crown prince, has been basically cut out of the picture, and it is now bin Salman who has all the power. And you just wonder what sort of advice he's getting. He is the commander-in-chief, he's in charge of the economy, he's also in charge of the biggest sell-off that Saudi Arabia has had. All that power in the hands of one man. And what's Britain's role in all of this? Britain's role is basically to sort of feed the monster. And they will say, well, if we don't do it, the French will. Of course the French would do that. But that's not an argument for continuing with this system. So at some point, we've just got to say, what are we doing to Yemen? What are we doing to the people? How are we protecting them?
Is it possible, David, that this Yemen war could be a harbinger of the downfall of the Saudi regime?
Well, I'm not a forecaster. I just don't know how long these processes are going to last. I believe in the Arab Spring. I believe in a process whereby there is a democratic uprising which will knock out the dictators of the Gulf, including the House of Saud. I just don't know when that's going to happen. I think we're in for a very, very long and bumpy process. But I think there are... I mean, the other thing you've got to think of is that for the first time, there is poverty in Saudi Arabia, right? We're just about to run a big series on that. People are going to be taxed for the first time in Saudi Arabia. Now, how long before the penny drops and you have...
For their own people.
For their own people. And you have a people that actually says, well, hang on a moment. If the king goes off on a flurry to Indonesia and takes 500 tons of luggage with him, what's there left for me? What is actually going to happen? We always think of Saudi Arabia as a rich country. Actually, it's got extreme inequality of wealth. When is that going to start filtering through? When are we going to start having more demands for women's rights, for basic democratic participation?
Well, when it starts, we'll read it in the Middle East Eye first before we see it on the BBC, that's for sure. David Hearst, thanks for joining us on the Sputnik. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
So, Dutch elections, Dutch elections, Dutch elections. And this morning my friend asked me, are you relieved? And I'm not actually, because Wilders came second largest party. And on Twitter, Smoking Hand says, the left have been responsible for this. They have never listened to people's legitimate concerns. Whereas Truth Seeker says, Europe might be finally waking up. The US and the UK were talked about as warnings, and the Dutch responded.
Well, I think the last analysis is frankly wrong.
And I'm
only half convinced by the first. Certainly, the Dutch Labour Party has been wiped out. And I don't believe
New Labour, yeah?
Yeah, it's the Dutch Blair Party.
It is.
And they will never come back. Just like PASOK in Greece will never come back. and the Socialist Party in Spain will never come back. And unless Labour in Britain moves sharply, there's a real danger of the same thing happening to them.
Well, that's all the tweets we have time for today.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
But you can stay in touch with us on social media, on Twitter and Instagram, RT_Sputnik, or on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.